The knock came at 11:40 at night. 3 sharp knuckles against wood, then nothing. I opened the door to find my ex-wife's sister standing in the rain, soaked through her coat, mascara tracked in 2 gray lines down her jaw. But nothing prepared me for the 4 words she said next. The rain had been coming down since sundown, hard enough to turn the gravel behind my workshop into a shallow river, and I was still out there at 11 at night, running my thumb along a strip of teak that wasn't ready to be sanded yet. That's when headlights swept across the wall, too bright and too close, and I heard a car door slam like it had been kicked shut. I set the plane down and wiped my hands on my apron before I'd even reached the door. Ashley was standing on my porch, soaked through, one hand pressed flat against the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "I just called off my engagement," she said before I'd even gotten the door all the way open. "My name is Michael Bennett. I'm 32, and I restore old wooden boats for a living out of a shop 2 blocks off the Willamette River in the Whitaker neighborhood of Eugene, Oregon. Most days I talk to more dead men's boats than living people, vessels that some grandfather built with his own hands 60 years ago, handed down to grandsons who don't know a keel from a gunnel. I like the quiet of it. Wood tells you the truth if you're patient enough to sand down to it. I hadn't always lived alone out here. 3 years ago I was married to Rachel, Ashley's older sister, and for a good while I believed that marriage was the kind that lasted. Nothing dramatic ended it. Rachel wanted a family right away. I wanted to wait until the shop could actually support one. We never turned it into a fight. We just stopped bringing it up, and somewhere in that silence, the marriage quietly ran out of road. By the time we admitted it out loud, there wasn't much left to salvage, just 2 people being polite about a life they'd already stopped building together. Since then, my days had settled into a shape I didn't mind. Coffee at 5:30, black, no sugar, radio on low in the shop by 6, sand, plane, varnish, repeat, until the light went orange over the river and I called it done. I hadn't spoken to Rachel in over a year. I hadn't spoken to Ashley in longer than that, not since the divorce made every family gathering feel like walking through a room full of furniture you used to own. So when she showed up on my porch soaked and unraveling, the first thing I felt wasn't sympathy. It was confusion, sharp and immediate, the kind that makes you check the street behind someone before you check their face. "Ashley," I said it carefully, like the name itself might be fragile. "What are you doing here? It's almost midnight." I didn't know where else to go. Her voice cracked somewhere in the middle of the sentence. Everyone else would they'd make it about them, about the wedding, about the money. I just needed somewhere quiet. That part at least made a strange kind of sense. Ashley had always been the one who noticed things other people didn't. When Rachel and I were still married, it was Ashley who'd ask how the shop was doing before she asked how the marriage was doing, because she already sensed which question I could actually answer honestly. She used to sit on the porch steps of our old house and talk to me about nothing in particular, while Rachel was on the phone with someone about the wedding she was planning for someone else. Always someone else, some cousin or coworker. Always a party Ashley hadn't been invited to plan for herself. I stepped back from the door. "Come in before you catch pneumonia." She hesitated on the threshold, swaying slightly, and for a second I thought she might change her mind and bolt back into the rain, rather than face whatever was waiting for her inside. My kitchen, my quiet, the ghost of a marriage that used to include her too. Then she stepped in, dripping onto the mat, and I realized how much smaller she looked than I remembered. 29 years old and standing in my hallway like a kid who'd gotten lost walking home from school. I made coffee because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. She sat at my kitchen table, wrapped in a flannel throw blanket I kept on the couch, and told me the story in pieces that didn't quite line up. A fight about guest lists, a comment her fiancé Daniel had made about her father's boat business that she couldn't stop turning over in her head. A silence at dinner that had apparently gone on so long it broke something neither of them could name afterward. She wasn't crying anymore by the time she finished. She just looked tired, the specific tired of someone who has spent an entire evening arguing with themselves in the car. "You don't have to explain it all tonight," I told her, setting the coffee in front of her. "It's late, you can crash on the couch. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. You're not going to ask if I called Rachel?" I hadn't thought about it honestly until she said it. Should you? No. The word came out fast, almost defensive. This isn't about her. I didn't want to be alone tonight, and you were the only person I could think of who wouldn't try to fix it before I even finished the sentence. I understood that better than I wanted to admit. She stayed on the couch that night, and I assumed that would be the end of it. One strange rain-soaked evening. A story we'd both feel awkward about by the following week. But 3 days later, her car was in my driveway again, this time at a reasonable hour, and she was standing in my workshop doorway asking if she could watch me work for a while. Because her father's house, Frank's house where she'd been staying since calling off the wedding, felt too full of questions she didn't have answers to yet. I didn't ask many questions either. I just handed her a rag and told her if she wanted to be useful, she could help me clean the brass fittings off an old runabout I'd pulled out of a barn in Cottage Grove. She was terrible at it, too impatient, scrubbing too hard in one direction, but she didn't complain. And something about having another set of hands in that shop again, even clumsy ones, filled a silence I hadn't realized had gotten so loud. It became a habit before either of us called it one. She'd come by 2, sometimes 3 afternoons a week, always with some excuse. She needed to get out of her father's house, she was bored, she wanted to see how the boat was coming along. I never pushed on the real reason. I had a feeling it wasn't really about the boat, and I had a feeling she knew I knew that. And neither of us said it out loud, because saying it out loud would have made it something we'd have to decide what to do about. One afternoon, about 10 days in, Frank himself dropped by unannounced, ostensibly to check on the runabout's progress. He stood in the doorway a long moment before he said anything. Watching Ashley sand a gunnel with more focus than I'd ever seen her give anything, sawdust caught in her hair, and something crossed his face I couldn't quite read. Not disapproval exactly. Something closer to recognition. He didn't say a word about it. He just asked how the brass fittings were coming along and left 20 minutes later with a promise to bring by more parts from the barn. Rachel's name came up exactly once that week, and only because Ashley brought it up herself unprompted, while we were taking a break on the back steps of the shop. She called me yesterday, she said, not quite looking at me. Wanted to know if I was doing okay. I didn't tell her where I'd been spending my afternoons. I didn't ask her to elaborate, and she didn't offer more. But something in the way she said it told me this wasn't a subject either of us was ready to open all the way yet. Not the failed engagement, and not whatever this was quietly becoming between us in the meantime. She started noticing things about my routine the way I'd once noticed things about hers. That I took my coffee at exactly 5:30. That I hummed under my breath when I was concentrating and had no idea I did it. That I never left a tool out of place even when I was exhausted. One Thursday I came into the shop to find she'd already started the coffee maker. The mug set out in the exact spot I always left it, and I stood in the doorway a moment too long before saying anything. Because it had been a long time since anyone paid that kind of attention to me without being asked. That same week, going through a crate of salvage parts Frank had dropped off from an old fishing boat he'd owned decades ago. A boat he wanted restored not to sell but to keep, he'd said, for reasons he didn't explain. I found a small bronze plate buried under a layer of oilcloth and sawdust. It was tarnished nearly black, the engraving barely visible, but when I rubbed my thumb across it I could make out 4 letters and a date. A boat's nameplate, something that had once told the whole world what a vessel was called before the world forgot to ask. Ashley picked it up before I could stop her, turning it over in her hands like it might crack. "What is this?" "Nameplate," I said. "Off your dad's old boat, I'm guessing. Probably came off the transom sometime before he sold her the first time." She ran her thumb over the engraving the same way I had, slow, like she was trying to read something underneath the tarnish that wasn't quite legible yet. "It's got a name on it, I can't make it out." "We'll clean it up, see what it says." She set it down on the workbench between us, careful, like it was something that mattered more than either of us wanted to admit out loud yet, and for a second neither of us reached for it again. Outside, the light was already going orange over the river. I should have told her to head home right then. Her father would be wondering where she'd spent the afternoon, and I had a shop full of half-finished work and a coffee habit that started before sunrise regardless of how little sleep I'd gotten. Instead, I found a strip of fine steel wool and handed it to her without a word. And she took it without asking why, and we stood there in the fading light cleaning tarnish off a name neither of us could read yet, in no particular hurry to find out what it said, or to admit to ourselves exactly why neither of us wanted this afternoon to end. By the second week of November, Ashley's spare jacket had a permanent hook by my back door, and I'd stopped noticing it was there. That was the thing that got me first, not some big moment, just the small accumulation of her things settling into my space the way water settles into the low points of a floor. A second coffee mug that had quietly become hers. A pair of work gloves 2 sizes too small for me. Left on the bench because mine kept blistering her hands. I found myself buying the creamer she used instead of the black coffee I'd drunk alone for 3 years, and I didn't examine that too closely, because examining it meant admitting something I wasn't ready to say out loud yet. We'd settled into an easy rhythm by then. She'd show up around 1. We'd work until the light started going, and some evenings she stayed for dinner because driving back to Frank's house on an empty stomach seemed, in her words, needlessly tragic. We didn't talk about Daniel much. We didn't talk about Rachel at all. It was easier that way, both of us tacitly agreeing to let the shop be a place outside of everything either of us had lost. The nameplate sat cleaned on a shelf above my workbench by then, the tarnish gone, 4 letters legible under the lamplight. Josephine. Neither of us had asked Frank about it yet. Some part of me suspected Ashley already knew and wasn't saying, the way people sometimes protect a piece of information until they're sure the other person is ready to hold it. One Saturday morning she showed up before I'd even had my coffee, which had never happened before, and stood in my kitchen doorway holding a paper bag from the bakery 2 blocks from her father's house. I didn't want to eat alone again, she said, like that explained the hour. We ate cinnamon rolls standing at my counter because I didn't own enough chairs for 2 people who weren't used to sitting down together. And she told me about a customer who'd tried to talk her father down on the price of a restoration for 40 minutes the day before. And I told her about a woman in Cottage Grove who'd cried when I returned her late husband's fishing boat, fully restored, exactly 1 year after he'd passed. Neither story was really the point. The point was that we'd started collecting each other's small daily material, the ordinary texture of a life, the way people do only when they've quietly decided they want to keep being told it. I noticed something odd that morning I couldn't quite place at the time. Ashley kept glancing at her phone, face tightening slightly each time, then setting it face down on the counter without saying anything about it. I didn't ask. I wish now I had, because it would have saved us both a rougher afternoon a few days later. But at the time it felt like prying into a corner of her life she hadn't invited me into yet. Daniel showed up on a Tuesday unannounced, the way people do when they've spent 3 days convincing themselves it's a good idea. I heard the bell over my shop door before I saw him, and when I turned around he was standing just inside the entrance in a coat that cost more than my truck, looking at Ashley with the particular expression of a man rehearsing a speech he hadn't finished writing. "Can we talk?" he said to her, not acknowledging me at all. Ashley set down the rag she was holding, slow and deliberate. "There's nothing left to say, Daniel. You're spending your afternoons at your sister's ex-husband's shop." He said it like it was evidence in a trial. "People are talking. People can talk." Her voice didn't rise. "I'm not explaining my life to you anymore." He looked at me then, finally, like he was seeing me for the first time and didn't like what the sight confirmed. "This is exactly the kind of thing that made me wonder if you ever really wanted to marry me at all." I didn't say anything. It wasn't my fight to finish. And I'd learned a long time ago that the fastest way to lose an argument that isn't yours is to jump into it. Ashley handled it herself, calm in a way that told me this wasn't the first time she'd had to be calmer than she felt. "I called off the wedding because of us, Daniel, not because of Michael. Don't make this smaller than it is by blaming someone who has nothing to do with it." He left without saying anything else, the bell over the door ringing too loud in the silence he left behind. Ashley stood very still for a moment, staring at the space where he'd been, and I realized her hands were shaking slightly even though her voice hadn't. "You okay?" "I will be." She picked the rag back up like nothing had happened, though her hands said otherwise. I went back to my own bench, giving her the room to settle, but I kept catching myself watching her out of the corner of my eye. The careful way she was breathing, the extra force she was putting into strokes that didn't need it. I understood that particular performance of being fine. I'd spent most of the last 3 years giving it myself, alone in this same shop, convincing an empty room I didn't need anyone to witness it. For what it's worth, I said eventually. You didn't owe him an explanation, not about me, not about anything. I know. She didn't look up. Doesn't mean it didn't cost something to say it out loud anyway. That was the thing about Ashley I'd started to understand by then. She said the true thing even when it cost her every time, which was more than I could say for myself at that same age, back when I'd let a marriage end in silence rather than pay that particular cost even once. It was maybe an hour later, the two of us sanding the transom in a silence that had gone comfortable again, when she said the thing that changed how I understood the last 3 years of my own life. There's something I never told you, she said, not looking up from the wood, about why things fell apart with you and Rachel. I stopped sanding. About a year before the divorce, Rachel called me scared. She said she wasn't sure she wanted kids yet, but she was terrified of telling you because she thought you'd think she was choosing the shop's uncertainty over you, or that you'd feel like you'd failed her by not being ready sooner. I told her to just say it plainly. I told her honesty wouldn't break you two, that you were stronger than that. Ashley's voice caught. But I said it in a way that made it sound easy, like a checklist. Just tell him, I said, like it was that simple. And when she finally did say it, it came out sounding exactly as flat and rehearsed as my advice had been. Not like fear, like a decision already made. I think that's part of why you heard it the way you did. I've carried that for 3 years, Michael. I gave her the words that ended your marriage, and I never told either of you that. I didn't know what to do with that at first. It would have been easy to feel angry. A whole marriage rerouted by advice given with good intentions and bad timing. But sitting there in the sawdust light of my own shop, all I felt was a kind of tired recognition. Nobody had lied. Nobody had betrayed anybody. 2 people who loved each other had just failed, separately, to say the true thing at the true moment, and a third person who loved them both had tried to help, and only made the gap wider. You didn't end my marriage, I told her. We did that ourselves, one silence at a time. You just handed her a sentence. We're the ones who never finished the conversation. I sat in my car outside his shop for 11 minutes before I found the nerve to go in and tell him, because some truths are easier to plan than to say, and I'd been planning this one for 3 years. Some truths don't destroy you when you finally say them. They only feel like they will right up until the moment they're out of your mouth, and after that, the silence they leave behind is lighter than the one they replace. We didn't talk for a while after that. Not out of anger, just out of the particular quiet that follows something true finally being spoken aloud. She left before dinner that night for the first time in weeks, and I stood in the doorway watching her taillights disappear down the gravel road, aware of an ache that had nothing to do with Rachel at all anymore. She came back 2 days later, which told me more than any apology could have. We didn't mention Daniel again, and we didn't mention the confession either, not directly. We just went back to the shop, to the runabout, to the particular quiet that had become its own kind of language between us. But something had shifted in the way she stood near me while we worked. A half step closer than before, like the truth she'd finally said out loud had used up whatever distance she'd been keeping on purpose. Frank came by twice more that month, always with some new excuse. A part he'd forgotten to bring, a question about the finished coat. And both times he lingered longer than the excuse required, watching the two of us work in a silence he seemed to be measuring against some memory of his own. He never asked outright what was happening between his daughter and his former son-in-law. But the last time he left, he paused at the door and said almost to himself, "Josephine would have liked watching this," and walked out before I could ask him what he meant. 3 months later, the nameplate was still sitting on that shelf above my workbench, and Frank still hadn't come to collect the runabout, though it had been finished for weeks, an excuse we both understood without ever naming it out loud. Ashley had started talking, carefully, about a job opening at a marine restoration outfit 2 towns over, close enough to visit her father, close enough to keep coming by the shop if she decided that was still what she wanted. She hadn't given me an answer. I hadn't asked for one, not directly, because some part of me was afraid of what it would mean if I asked and didn't like what I heard. But every time she brought it up, she watched my face a half-second longer than the question required, like she was waiting for me to say the thing neither of us had said yet, and like she already suspected I wasn't ready to say it. Not yet. Not until I understood exactly what I was asking her to stay for. 2 weeks after that afternoon on the back steps, Ashley called the marine restoration outfit in Cottage Grove and accepted the job. She told me over the phone, not in person, her voice careful in a way that made it clear she was watching for my reaction even through the line. "It's only 40 minutes away," she said before I could respond. I wasn't leaving. I just needed to say yes to something for myself, for once, instead of waiting to see what everyone else needed first. "I know," I told her. And I did know. I'd spent 3 years learning the difference between someone leaving and someone finally choosing their own ground to stand on. 1 month later, Frank asked me to bring the runabout down to the dock behind his property for her first real water test since I'd finished the restoration. Ashley came along, and so, unexpectedly, did Frank himself, wearing an old canvas jacket I'd never seen him in before. The kind a man keeps for occasions he doesn't talk about in advance. We got the boat into the water just as the afternoon light was turning gold over the reservoir, and Frank sat in the bow the whole first stretch without saying much, running his hand along the varnished gunnel like he was checking my work. Except his eyes weren't on the joinery. They were somewhere further off. "I built half of this boat myself, you know," he said finally, not looking at either of us. 41 years ago. For Josephine. She used to say I loved this boat more than I loved sitting still with her, and for a long time I thought that was just her teasing me. He paused, and the engine's low hum filled the space where his next words should have been. It wasn't teasing. Not entirely. I was scared of something back then. Money was tight, the shop wasn't steady, and instead of telling her that, I just worked longer hours and let her think I didn't want to be home. We almost didn't make it past our 4th year. Nobody in this family knows that. Not even the girls. Ashley went very still beside me. "What changed it?" I asked. "She sat me down on this exact boat and told me she'd rather have my worry, said out loud, than my silence pretending everything was fine." I didn't have a good answer for her. I just knew I didn't want to lose her over something I hadn't even had the courage to name. Frank finally looked at me, and something in his face made it clear this wasn't a story he was telling by accident. "I watched you and Rachel go quiet on each other the same way 3 years ago, and I didn't say a word. Told myself it wasn't my place. I've regretted that every year since. So I'm saying something now, even if it's late, whatever this is between the two of you. Don't let it die of politeness. That's how the first one almost did." Nobody spoke for a while after that. The reservoir carried the sound of the engine out across the water, and I found myself looking at the bronze nameplate, Josephine, now reinstalled on the transom where it belonged, thinking about how a piece of metal could carry 41 years of a marriage nobody had ever mentioned out loud until that afternoon. We dropped Frank back at his dock as the sun was going down, and he shook my hand a beat longer than usual before he climbed out, like there was something else he wanted to say, and had decided the handshake would have to carry it instead. Ashley didn't say much on the drive back to my place, staring out the passenger window at the tree line going dark, and I let the silence sit there without trying to fill it, because I'd finally learned the difference between a silence that needed rescuing and one that just needed room. "He's never told anyone that," she said eventually when we were almost home. "Not Rachel, not me. 41 years, and he just handed it to us on a boat like it was nothing. Maybe it stopped being nothing the day he decided we needed to hear it more than he needed to keep it." I glanced over at her in the dashboard light. 41 years is a long time to carry something alone. I think today cost him more than he let on. Maybe that's why he waited so long. Some things you can only put down once you're sure the people catching them won't drop them. That evening, after we'd docked and Frank had driven off ahead of us, Ashley and I sat on the tailgate of my truck in the cooling air, neither of us in a hurry to end the day. "I keep thinking about what he said," she told me. "About silence being the thing that almost cost him everything." "Me too. Michael." She turned to face me fully for the first time all day. "I'm not scared of this anymore. I was for a while, of what it meant, of what people would say, of whether it was too soon after Daniel or too complicated because of Rachel. But I'm not scared of it now. I just don't know if you are. I'd spent 3 years being careful with everything. Careful with the shop. Careful with my own expectations. Careful enough that carefulness had started to look a lot like hiding. I thought about Frank on that boat. 41 years of silence he'd almost let cost him a marriage, and I understood, finally, exactly what he'd been trying to warn me away from. I'm not scared, I said. I just didn't want to say it before I was sure I meant it completely. I do now. Nothing more dramatic happened than that. No grand declaration, no music swelling somewhere off camera. Just two people finally saying a true thing out loud, in a gravel driveway at the exact moment they were both ready to hear it. Next spring, almost a full year after that first rainy night on my porch, Ashley moved the rest of her things into the house. Not all at once, the way people do in movies, but slowly, the way real decisions actually happen, one drawer and one bookshelf at a time. Until one day I realized the hook by my back door held 2 jackets instead of 1, and had for months without either of us marking the occasion. Somewhere in those months, the shop had quietly become a shop for 2. She'd started taking on her own small restoration jobs on the side, a rocking chair for a neighbor, a jewelry box for a coworker, and I'd catch myself glancing over at her bench in the middle of the afternoon just to watch her work. The same focused stillness she'd had that very first week, sawdust in her hair, utterly unaware I was watching. Frank stopped by less often after that, not out of distance, but out of a kind of quiet satisfaction. The visits of a man who no longer needed to check on something he trusted was settled. Rachel came to Frank's birthday that June, the first time I'd seen her in over 3 years. I braced for it to be strange, and for a moment it was a held breath in the kitchen doorway when we first saw each other across the room. But she crossed to me before I could decide what to say, and hugged me, brief and genuine, and said only, "I'm glad it's you, I mean that." Then she went to find her sister, and the two of them stood by the dock for a long time, talking quietly, and whatever passed between them stayed between them, which felt like exactly how it should be. Later that evening, Rachel found me alone by the grill for a moment and added one more thing, quieter than the first. "I used to think I left because you wouldn't say what you wanted. I understand now I never really said it either. We were both just waiting for the other one to go first. It wasn't an apology exactly, and it didn't need to be. It was just 2 people finally agreeing on what had actually happened. 3 years too late to change anything and exactly in time to stop carrying it. A year to the day after Ashley first showed up on my porch, soaked through and unraveling, we took the runabout out again. Just the 2 of us this time. Out past the last dock on the reservoir where the water goes still and the light goes long. I'd kept something in my jacket pocket for 3 weeks by then, waiting for the right afternoon, and this felt like it. The reservoir was quiet in the way only early evening water gets quiet. No other boats out, just the small sound of the hull settling and a heron somewhere off in the reeds. Ashley leaned back against the gunwale with her eyes half closed. Sun warm on her face, looking more at ease than I think I'd ever seen her. And for a moment I just let myself watch her without saying anything at all. "You remember what you said, that first night?" I asked her, cutting the engine so the only sound left was water against the hull. "That I'd just called off my engagement." She almost laughed. Not exactly the line I'd have chosen looking back. I used to think that was the whole story, the ending of something. I turned to face her fully. Took me a year to understand it wasn't an ending at all. It was just the first true thing you ever said to me, and everything since has been us learning to keep saying true things instead of comfortable ones. I asked her there, on the water with Josephine's nameplate catching the last of the light behind her, and she said yes before I'd even finished getting the whole question out. Frank was right about one thing more than anything else he ever taught me with wood or brass or 40-year-old boats. The people we love rarely leave us because of the hard things we tell them. They leave us because of the true things we never say at all. Silence feels like protection while you're inside it, and it's only afterward, looking back across the years it cost you, that you understand it was never protecting anyone. It was just delaying a conversation somebody was eventually going to have alone. I spent 3 years mistaking quiet for peace, telling myself that not saying the hard thing was the same as keeping the peace, when really I was just postponing the cost and letting it grow interest. I know better now, and I'm grateful, in a strange way, that it took a rain-soaked knock at 11 at night to teach me. If there's a silence in your own life still waiting on the true thing underneath it, don't wait for someone else to say it first. And if you know somebody who needs to hear that today, send them this story. If this one meant something to you, hit like, subscribe for more stories like it, and tell me in the comments. Has silence ever cost you more than the hard conversation would have?